As Shadowed Pages, welcome to you all from Shadowed Pages. I'm Edward, your host for tonight, and I'm so glad you've joined me. Tell me, where are you tuning in from, and how's your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin the mystery. The train gave a small, weary sigh as it slowed into the station at Little Melford, as though it, too, had heard the rumors and found them exhausting. Beyond the platform, the countryside lay in a hush of late afternoon gold, hedgerows clipped into tidy obedience and bare-limbed trees scratching at the pale sky. Miss Marple stepped down with the careful patience of one accustomed to watching her footing and other people's tempers. She took in the place at a glance, how the porter's smile slipped when he read the label on her suitcase, how the station master's wife paused in her sweeping to stare a fraction longer than politeness allowed. "Hawthorne Manor," the porter said, and though he meant it as a simple confirmation, it came out like a warning. "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, as if she'd said, "a cup of tea. I believe someone is meeting me." The meeting arrived in the form of a motor car that looked too sleek for the village lane, driven by a man with a narrow face and contained movements of a person trained to appear invisible. He opened the door without introducing himself and took her bag as though it weighed nothing and mattered less. "Miss Marple," he said finally, once she was seated. "I am Mr. Pell, house manager." "Thank you, Mr. Pell," Miss Marple replied. "How very kind of you." The car moved off, and the village slipped behind them. The butcher's window with its neat pink rose, the churchyard leaning toward the road, the post office where two women had stopped talking with such suddenness that it might have been a physical blow. Miss Marple did not appear to notice. She watched the hedges, the gates, the little details of rural life that so often told the truth when people would not. A newly mended fence, for instance, or a patch of churned earth near a stile. Signs of agitation, of someone going somewhere in a hurry. Hawthorne Manor announced itself all at once, as these old houses like to do, with a sudden widening of the lane and a sweep of drive that curved through grounds that had once been proud and were now merely determined. The manor sat among tall hawthorn trees, their winter thorns black against the sky, with an air of brooding respectability that had been soured by neglect. The windows looked like eyes that had seen too much and would rather not speak of it. Even so, there was a beauty to it, an austere, tired beauty that made Miss Marple think of certain elderly ladies in St. Mary Mead who insisted on wearing pearls to breakfast. Inside, the air was warmer, smelling faintly of beeswax and something older, damp stone and the ghost of coal smoke. The hall was wide enough to swallow voices. Portraits lined the walls, stern men with severe mouths and women with pale throats and bright, clever eyes. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on one painted girl in a high collar, her expression curiously alert. Mr. Pell handed her over to a maid who had the tight mouth of someone who disliked surprises. Miss Marple was led up the great staircase, past a landing where the carpet had worn thin as though many feet had paused there, and into a guest room with a view of the south lawn and the lake beyond. A fire had been laid, but not lit. The chill of the room was not entirely physical. "Tea will be served downstairs at 5, the maid said. "How nice," Miss Marple answered, and smiled as though tea were always nice, even when it was meant to gather suspects together in one convenient place. When the maid had gone, Miss Marple unpacked with deliberate calm, placing her gloves neatly, setting her hat upon a chair, smoothing her skirt as if smoothing her thoughts. On the mantelpiece stood a small china vase of white flowers. Hothouse, certainly, in this season. Someone had made an effort. That, Miss Marple reflected, could be kindness or concealment. Often the two looked alike at first glance. Downstairs, the drawing room was as one expected. Heavy curtains, furniture that had been chosen to impress rather than comfort, and a silence that seemed to press politely against conversation. A tea table had been set near the fire, and around it sat the inhabitants of Hawthorne Manor as though arranged by an anxious hand. There was Lady Hawthorne, of course, Eleanor Hawthorne, slender, composed, with silver hair pinned into a style that suggested she never allowed herself to be surprised, even by grief. Her eyes, however, betrayed her. They were tired, and when she looked at Miss Marple, something flickered there. Relief, perhaps, and fear. "Miss Marple," Lady Hawthorne said, "how good of you to come on such short notice." "It's very little trouble," Miss Marple replied, accepting Lady Hawthorne's hand. Her fingers were cold, not merely from the room, cold from strain. Beside Lady Hawthorne sat Dr. Ambrose Finch, the village physician, a heavy man with a benevolent face and a mouth that had learned the habit of pronouncing certainties. He rose too quickly, almost knocking his teacup. "I told Eleanor it was unnecessary to trouble you," he said. "This is all quite dreadful, but there's no need to turn it into melodrama." Miss Marple smiled at him in exactly the way one smiled at a child, insisting that thunderstorms were made by angels bowling. "I'm sure you meant it kindly," she said. On the far side of the fire stood a young woman, Isabel Hawthorne, Lady Hawthorne's niece, pretty in a distracted way, with ink smudged on her fingers as though she'd been writing and had forgotten to stop. She watched Miss Marple with a bright, guarded curiosity. "I've heard of you," Isabel said, the words tumbling out too fast. "In the papers and, well, from people." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The papers are very fond of making things sound more exciting than they are." Isabel laughed, but it landed oddly, like something that had been rehearsed. There was also a man leaning against the bookcase with the casual defiance of someone who had decided that manners were optional. Rupert Hawthorne, Eleanor's stepson, broad-shouldered, handsome in a worn way, with eyes that darted restlessly as if seeking an exit. And near the window, half in shadow, sat Mrs. Blythe, the housekeeper, rigid as the carved backs of the chairs, her lips pressed so thin they nearly vanished. Mr. Pell poured tea with an air of practiced neutrality. As the cups were passed, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe. Lady Hawthorne's hand trembled when she lifted her cup, though she tried to hide it by adjusting the saucer. Rupert didn't take sugar, but he toyed with the tongs as if he might. Dr. Finch talked too much. Mrs. Blythe watched everyone else's cups as though poison might be slipped into them at any moment. Miss Marple waited until the first frantic politeness had settled, the way foam settled on poured milk. Then she spoke gently, as though asking after the weather. "Lady Hawthorne," she said, "you wrote that you were afraid. Not only unhappy, but afraid." Lady Hawthorne's eyes lowered to her tea. For a moment she seemed to listen to the crackle of the fire, as if it were speaking. When she looked up again, her composure had a hairline fracture. "My husband died 2 weeks ago," she said quietly. "Sir Giles, they say it was his heart." Dr. Finch made a satisfied sound. It was his heart. Miss Marple did not contradict him. She merely looked at Lady Hawthorne. "He was found in the library," Lady Hawthorne continued, each word placed carefully, like a step across thin ice. "Collapsed by the desk, nothing disturbed, no sign of anything. It should have been simple, terrible, but simple." "And it wasn't," Miss Marple said softly. Lady Hawthorne's fingers tightened around the teacup. "The night before he died," she said, "he told me there was something in the house, something he'd kept hidden, something he meant to tell me at last, because he thought it might be dangerous to leave it as it was." Rupert let out a short laugh that held no amusement. "Dangerous? That's Giles for you, always dramatizing." Lady Hawthorne's gaze flicked to him, sharp as a pin. "He wasn't given to dramatizing, Rupert," she said. "Not when he looked like that." Isabel's face had gone a little pale. "Aunt Eleanor, please," she murmured, but there was no real plea in it, only nerves. Miss Marple set her teacup down with great care. Did Sir Giles say what this thing was? She asked. Lady Hawthorne shook her head. No, he said he'd show me in the morning. He said there was a place beneath the house, an older part, sealed up, and that someone had been trying to get into it. Mrs. Blythe made a small sound, almost like a cough smothered in cloth. Her eyes darted toward the ceiling as if listening for footsteps above. Dr. Finch waved a hand. Old houses have drafts, noises, rats. People imagine things. And yet, Miss Marple said, still gentle, you invited me. Lady Hawthorne's voice dropped. Because 2 nights after his death, she said, I heard something down there, in the wall behind the library shelves, a tapping, slow, deliberate, like a code. And in the morning there was mud on the library carpet, as if someone had walked in from outside, though every door was locked and the ground beyond the windows was hard with frost. Rupert straightened, suddenly attentive. Isabel's hands clenched in her lap. Mr. Pell's face remained unchanged, but the hand holding the teapot paused for the briefest instant. Miss Marple watched them all, her expression mild, her mind alert. Fear did not arrive in a place without inviting its companions. Mud meant a way in. Tapping meant a message, or a signal, or perhaps simply impatience. And secrets sealed under old stone had a way of making the living behave strangely long before they were uncovered. I think, Miss Marple said, as though offering a simple opinion about jam, that we shall have to look at the library. The library lay at the far end of the west wing, and the walk to it felt longer than it ought to have been. Miss Marple noticed how the corridor narrowed slightly near the door, how the wallpaper had faded unevenly, as though furniture had once stood there for years and been moved only recently. Lady Hawthorne led the way with a stiff dignity, one hand resting against the wall as if to steady herself. The others followed in a loose, uncomfortable cluster, each person keeping a careful distance from the next. The room itself was large and dark-paneled, the sort of library designed to impress rather than invite lingering. Tall shelves marched along the walls, crammed with books that had been chosen for their bindings as much as their contents. A desk stood near the center, its surface too tidy to be entirely honest. The fire was cold now, but the scent of old smoke lingered along with something sharper, polish perhaps, or recently disturbed dust. This is where he was found, Lady Hawthorne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple moved slowly, as though every step were a courtesy to the dead. She stood where Sir Giles must have fallen, letting her eyes travel outward. The rug beneath her feet was thick, Persian, its pattern busy enough to hide a multitude of sins. She bent slightly, peering at the edge near the desk. There, worked into the fibers, was a faint smear, brown, dried, unmistakable. Mud, she said gently. Dr. Finch cleared his throat. Likely tracked in earlier. One can't expect perfection in a house this size. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, and did not say that the smear ran inward from the shelves, not from the door. She turned her attention to the bookcases. They were handsome things, solid oak, polished to a muted shine. Her fingers brushed the spines lightly as she walked, feeling for something out of place. It did not take long. One shelf, midway down the wall behind the desk, held books that were fractionally misaligned, as though replaced by someone in a hurry. A gap no wider than a finger separated the case from the wall. Miss Marple paused there, her head tilted. Lady Hawthorne, she said. May I? Lady Hawthorne nodded, though her face had gone pale. Miss Marple pressed gently against the shelf. There was a soft click, and the bookcase shifted inward, pivoting on hidden hinges. Isabel gasped, clapping a hand to her mouth. Rupert swore under his breath, not in surprise, but in irritation, as though a suspicion had just been confirmed. Behind the shelf was darkness and a breath of cold air that smelled of earth and stone. Miss Marple leaned closer, peering into the narrow opening. A short passage descended at an angle, the steps rough-hewn and worn in the center. The walls bore marks, scratches perhaps, or old tool scars, half hidden beneath a crust of damp. "This is it," Lady Hawthorne said. "He told me it was sealed. I never knew, never imagined it was here in plain sight." Mrs. Blythe made that same muffled sound again. "Sir Giles forbade anyone to touch that shelf," she said abruptly. "He said the wall behind it was unstable, dangerous." "And yet someone has been using it," Rupert said, his tone sharp. "Look at the steps." Miss Marple had already seen them. The stone was scuffed, not with the soft wear of centuries, but with the recent impatience of boots. Near the bottom of the visible steps lay a dark smear, wetter than the one on the rug. "Has anyone been down there?" Miss Marple asked, without looking up. There was a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the room. Dr. Finch shifted his weight. Isabel stared at the opening, her eyes bright with something that might have been fear or fascination. "No," Lady Hawthorne said at last. "Not to my knowledge." Miss Marple straightened and turned, her expression mild but attentive. "Not to your knowledge," she repeated. Rupert crossed his arms. If Giles had secrets under the house, they were his. He liked to collect rubbish, old deeds, family nonsense. Probably nothing but damp and rats. "And tapping?" Miss Marple asked. Rupert hesitated. "Houses make noises." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, and people make mistakes." She stepped back from the opening and let the shelf swing closed with a soft finality. The click echoed in the room, sounding louder than before. "Sir Giles died here," she said, her voice low. "But he did not come here to die. He came because he was disturbed, perhaps frightened, perhaps because he thought someone else had been here before him." Dr. Finch bristled. "You're implying." "I'm implying nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm observing." She moved to the desk then, examining its contents with polite discretion. Papers were stacked neatly, too neatly, as though someone had arranged them after the fact. A blotter lay square to the edge, its ink marks old and faded. One drawer was locked. Miss Marple touched the handle lightly. "Who has the key?" she asked. Mrs. Blythe spoke before anyone else could. "Sir Giles kept it on his person. After his death, it was returned to Lady Hawthorne." Lady Hawthorne looked startled. Yes, I put it in my jewel box. I didn't think." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said kindly. "Grief rearranges priorities." She crossed to the window and looked out onto the lawn. The frost had melted in patches, leaving the ground soft and dark. Near the wall beneath the window, the grass was flattened, as though something heavy had rested there, or someone. Miss Marple turned back to the room, taking them all in, the stiff defiance, the careful silences, the fear disguised as practicality. "Someone came into this room after Sir Giles spoke to Lady Hawthorne," she said. "Perhaps before. Someone knew about the passage. Someone walked in from outside, muddying the rug, and went back the same way. And Sir Giles, finding evidence of that intrusion, came here to confirm his fears." Lady Hawthorne pressed a hand to her mouth. Isabel shook her head slowly, as though denying a thought she could not quite suppress. "And whatever he discovered," Miss Marple continued, "was enough to make his heart fail, or enough to frighten him into collapse." Dr. Finch opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miss Marple looked once more at the hidden shelf, at the wall that had kept its secret badly. Old houses, she thought, were very much like old people. They remembered everything, and sooner or later they told the truth, whether one wished to hear it or not. Miss Marple suggested, with the air of proposing something entirely ordinary, that they all sit down. The suggestion had the effect of breaking a spell. Chairs were drawn out, skirts smoothed, and the room rearranged itself into a semblance of normality, though the hidden passage seemed to press against the walls like a held breath. Lady Hawthorne took the chair nearest the fire, her posture composed but rigid, as though she feared that any relaxation might allow her thoughts to escape her control. Rupert remained standing, leaning against the desk with deliberate insolence. Isabel perched on the edge of a chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Finch settled himself opposite Miss Marple, folding his hands across his waist in a gesture that suggested authority. Mrs. Blythe lingered near the door, as if unwilling to turn her back on the room. Miss Marple waited. Silence, she knew, had a way of loosening tongues. Sir Giles was not a man to imagine threats, she said at last. People like him, collectors, organizers, trust in order. When something disturbs that order, they notice. Rupert gave a short, humorless laugh. Giles noticed everything, didn't stop him from making enemies. Lady Hawthorne looked at him sharply. Enemies? Rupert shrugged. He had a talent for uncovering things other people preferred to leave buried. Family histories, old scandals. He liked to say the truth was a moral duty. And you disagreed? Miss Marple asked. I disagreed with the mess it made, Rupert said, and with the way he used it. Truth can be a weapon. Isabel stirred. Uncle Giles wasn't cruel, she said, though her voice wavered. He didn't see why people should be protected from their own pasts. Miss Marple nodded. A common failing. And did this particular past involve the house? Isabel hesitated, then glanced at Lady Hawthorne, who gave a small, reluctant nod. There was something about Hawthorne Manor, Isabel said slowly. Something Sir Giles had been researching. Old ownership records. Renovations that were never filed properly. He said there were discrepancies. Discrepancies, Rupert repeated. That's what he called them. I called them a hobby. Mrs. Blythe spoke suddenly, her voice sharp with long-held restraint. It wasn't a hobby, she said. He had men digging near the north wall last autumn. Said he was checking the foundations. Lady Hawthorne stiffened. I thought that was to address the damp. So he said, Mrs. Blythe replied. But they didn't dig deep. They dug carefully. Miss Marple's eyes brightened a fraction. Did anyone find anything? Mrs. Blythe's mouth tightened. Not that I was told, but after that, Sir Giles locked certain rooms, and he forbade anyone to go into the lower cellars. Dr. Finch shifted. Old houses have cellars that are unsafe. That proves nothing. No, Miss Marple agreed. It proves interest. She turned to Lady Hawthorne. When your husband spoke to you the night before he died, did he seem afraid? Lady Hawthorne considered. He seemed resolved and troubled. He said he'd been wrong to wait, that secrets had a way of growing. Rupert snorted softly. He always did enjoy the sound of his own wisdom. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Did you know about the passage behind the bookcase? Rupert's jaw tightened. I knew the house had oddities. Every old place does. That is not an answer, Miss Marple said mildly. Rupert met her gaze, irritation flickering into something else. All right. I knew there was a sealed section under the west wing. Giles mentioned it years ago. Said it was walled off after an accident. An accident? Isabel echoed. That's what he said, Rupert replied. A worker killed during renovations in the 19th century. They sealed the area rather than deal with it properly. Miss Marple tilted her head. And you accepted that? At the time, yes. And later? Rupert shrugged again, but less convincingly. Later, I stopped listening. Miss Marple turned her attention to Dr. Finch. You examined Sir Giles? Of course, Dr. Finch said stiffly. I certified the death. And you found nothing unusual. He had a weak heart. Stress would have been sufficient. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Stress is a very accommodating explanation. Dr. Finch bristled. Are you suggesting I overlooked something? I am suggesting, Miss Marple replied gently, that the cause of death and the reason for distress are not always the same thing. Mrs. Blythe shifted her weight. There were noises, she said abruptly, before Sir Giles died, at night in the walls. Lady Hawthorne looked at her, startled. Why didn't you tell me? Mrs. Blythe's eyes dropped. Because Sir Giles told me not to. He said if anyone mentioned it, there would be trouble. Trouble for whom? Miss Marple asked. For all of us, Mrs. Blythe said. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Did Sir Giles receive any visitors in the days before his death? Isabel hesitated. There was a man, she said slowly. I saw him from the upstairs window, near the lake. He didn't come to the house, but Sir Giles went out to meet him. Rupert frowned. You never mentioned that. I wasn't sure it mattered, Isabel said, flushing. They argued. I couldn't hear what was said, but Uncle Giles was angry. More than I'd ever seen him. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did you recognize the man? Isabel shook her head. He wore a hat and a coat with mud on the hem. Mud, Miss Marple thought, settling neatly into its place. After that, Isabel continued, Uncle Giles spent the evening in the library. I heard him pacing. And the tapping? Miss Marple asked. Isabel swallowed. I thought it was the pipes, but now... Miss Marple let the thought hang. Lady Hawthorne pressed her fingers together. Do you think, she asked quietly, that someone was trying to frighten him? Miss Marple considered. Possibly, or to retrieve something he had found, or to prevent him from speaking. Rupert laughed again, harsher this time. You make it sound like a melodrama. Life often is, Miss Marple said softly, when people insist on burying things rather than resolving them. She rose then, smoothing her skirt. I should like to see the grounds near the lake, she said, and the cellars, particularly the parts that were locked. Dr. Finch opened his mouth to object, but Lady Hawthorne stood as well. Of course, she said. Whatever you need. Miss Marple glanced once more at the bookcase, at the wall that had concealed more than stone and dust. Someone, she was quite certain, had been walking very deliberately through Hawthorne Manor long before Sir Giles's heart had given out, and whoever it was had not yet finished. The air outside was sharper than Miss Marple had expected, the kind of cold that slipped neatly through wool and settled into the bones. The grounds sloped gently away from the house toward the lake, its surface a dull, pewter sheen beneath the fading sky. Miss Marple walked with measured steps, her gaze lowered as often as it was lifted, attending to the small betrayals the earth made when pressed by human intention. Lady Hawthorne accompanied her, drawing her coat tighter. Rupert followed at a short distance, hands thrust into his pockets, while Isabel lingered behind, glancing back toward the house as though half expecting someone to appear at an upper window. Mrs. Blythe had excused herself with visible relief, and Dr. Finch had remained indoors, claiming the chill aggravated his joints. Near the edge of the lake, the ground softened into a dark, yielding strip where reeds had been trampled down. Miss Marple paused there, examining the impressions left behind. They were not fresh, but neither were they old. Boots, she thought, and more than one set. One had lingered longer than the others, weight shifting back and forth in agitation. This is where they met, she said quietly. Isabel drew closer. How can you be sure? The ground tells us, Miss Marple replied. People wait differently from how they walk. Waiting leaves uncertainty behind. Rupert scoffed, but his eyes followed her gesture despite himself. Sir Giles came out here the day before he died, Miss Marple continued. He met someone who did not wish to be seen entering the house, someone who knew where the soft ground was and didn't mind leaving traces because they believed no one would look closely enough. Lady Hawthorne's lips pressed together. Who would know that? Anyone who has walked these grounds often, Miss Marple said gently, or someone who learned quickly. They turned back toward the house, circling to the side where the west wing met the slope of the hill. A low stone wall ran along this section, its mortar crumbling in places. Miss Marple crouched, ignoring the protest of her knees, and examined a patch near the foundation where the earth had been disturbed and hastily tamped down again. "This is newer than the rest," she said. Rupert frowned. "Maintenance work, probably." "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed, "but maintenance does not usually leave such irregular edges. Nor does it stop abruptly, as though someone were interrupted." Isabel stared at the wall. "Is this near the library?" "Directly beneath it," Miss Marple said. They returned indoors by a side entrance that led them into a narrow passage smelling of stone and damp. The cellars lay below, reached by a steep staircase that curved downward like a throat-swallowing light. Lady Hawthorne hesitated at the top. "I haven't been down here since—" She stopped herself. "Since before my marriage." Miss Marple touched her arm briefly. "We shall go slowly." The cellar was divided into sections, some neatly organized with racks of wine and preserved goods, others sealed by heavy doors darkened with age. Miss Marple noted the locks immediately. One bore scratches around the keyhole, subtle but unmistakable. "This one," she said. Lady Hawthorne produced a ring of keys with a faint clink that sounded louder than it should have in the enclosed space. The door opened reluctantly, the hinges protesting with a low groan. Inside was a smaller chamber, colder still, its walls rough and uneven. The air carried the unmistakable scent of earth. A narrow opening yawned at the far end, half hidden behind a stack of old crates. Miss Marple moved toward it, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The passage beyond slanted upward, unmistakably the continuation of the hidden route behind the library. "So it was never sealed completely," Rupert said flatly. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It was concealed. There is a difference." On the floor lay a length of rope, frayed at one end, and beside it, a small metal object half buried in dust. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. It was a button, heavy, with an unfamiliar crest. Isabel leaned closer. "That doesn't belong to anyone here." "Quite," Miss Marple said. She traced the wall with her fingers, feeling the grooves and tool marks. "This passage has been used recently," she said. "Not just by Sir Giles, and not just once." Rupert's expression darkened. "You think someone was coming in and out without our knowing?" "I think someone believed they had the right," Miss Marple said softly. "Rights, after all, are very persuasive things." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of stone and secrecy pressing in around them. "When Sir Giles discovered this," Lady Hawthorne said slowly, "he must have realized someone else knew." "And that knowledge frightened him," Miss Marple replied. "Or angered him. Possibly both." She handed the button to Rupert. "You said your stepfather enjoyed uncovering the past. Perhaps the past objected." Rupert turned the button over in his hand, jaw tight. "You think this has something to do with the house's old owners? Or with someone who believes they were wronged by them," Miss Marple said. "Such beliefs have a way of surviving generations." They made their way back upstairs in thoughtful silence. Miss Marple paused once more at the cellar door, glancing back into the darkness. "Someone has been moving through this house like a ghost," she said quietly. "But ghosts are usually memories. This one leaves footprints." As they emerged into the warmer light of the hall, Miss Marple's face remained composed, but her thoughts were already fitting together. A secret beneath the house. A man from the lake. A passage used not just for hiding, but for claiming. And Sir Giles, standing inconveniently between what was buried and what someone wanted, brought back into the light. The discovery of the button lingered in the air like an unanswered question, and Miss Marple sensed that it had unsettled Rupert more than he wished to admit. He carried it with him as they returned to the ground floor, turning it over absently in his fingers, his earlier bravado dulled into something closer to apprehension. Lady Hawthorne moved more slowly now, as though the house itself had grown heavier around her. In the drawing room, a fire had been lit at last, its warmth pressing back the chill but not quite dispelling it. Mrs. Blythe had returned, arranging cups with a precision that bordered on compulsion. When she noticed the dirt on Isabel's shoes and the dust on Miss Marple's hem, her mouth tightened. "You went down there," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. It was very instructive. Mrs. Blythe's hands paused. Sir Giles always said it would bring no good. Miss Marple took a seat, folding her gloves neatly in her lap. "People often say that when something threatens to be uncovered," she said gently. "It does not mean they are wrong, only that the danger already exists." Rupert dropped into a chair opposite her. "Let's stop circling around it," he said sharply. "What do you think was down there? Gold, documents, some ridiculous family curse?" Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. "Not gold," she said. "If it were, Sir Giles would have been delighted rather than anxious. No, I suspect papers, or evidence, something that changed the story of this house." Lady Hawthorne sat very still. Giles always said Hawthorne Manor had been acquired under unusual circumstances, she said quietly. The family gained it quickly after the previous owner died. "Died how?" Miss Marple asked. Lady Hawthorne hesitated. Officially, it was an accident, a fall, but there were rumors. Mrs. Blythe inhaled sharply. "People said he disappeared," she murmured, "that the body was never rightly found." Isabel looked between them. "Why was I never told this?" "Because it was all nonsense," Rupert said too quickly. "Village gossip. Giles liked to dress it up as research." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Village gossip often contains the bones of truth," she said, "and bones have a habit of resurfacing." Rupert flinched at that, though whether from the image or the implication was unclear. "Tell me," Miss Marple continued, "about the man Isabel saw by the lake. Has anyone else noticed a stranger in the area?" Mrs. Blythe nodded reluctantly. "There was someone asking questions last month," she said, "at the post office, about the old estate boundaries." Lady Hawthorne looked startled. "Why wasn't I informed?" "He never came here," Mrs. Blythe said, "and Sir Giles told me not to trouble you with every curiosity seeker." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did Sir Giles speak to you about him?" Mrs. Blythe's lips pressed together. "He asked if anyone had been poking around the west wing, or the cellars." "And had they?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Blythe hesitated. "I thought not. But now..." The fire crackled, a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. "Sir Giles suspected someone was trying to reclaim something," Miss Marple said. "Not steal it, but reclaim it. That distinction matters." Rupert laughed harshly. "Reclaim from whom? The past doesn't have legal standing." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but resentment often behaves as though it does." She turned to Isabel. "You said your uncle argued with the man by the lake. Did you notice anything else?" Isabel frowned, concentrating. "He kept pointing toward the house," she said slowly. And Uncle Giles shook his head. "Over and over." Miss Marple nodded. "Refusal," she said softly. Lady Hawthorne's hands twisted together. If there was something hidden, something that proved wrongdoing, Giles would have felt obliged to reveal it. "Even if it destroyed the family," Rupert demanded. "Especially then," Miss Marple said gently. "Some people value truth more than comfort." Rupert stood abruptly and began to pace. "So someone frightened him, threatened him, and he died of a weak heart, that's all." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but there is another possibility." They all looked at her. "Sir Giles may have gone into the passage himself that night," she said. "He may have found something unexpected, something that confirmed his fears. Fear can be as lethal as any poison." Dr. Finch's absence seemed suddenly conspicuous, his earlier certainty ringing hollow in Miss Marple's thoughts. "And the tapping," Lady Hawthorne whispered. "A signal," Miss Marple replied. "Or a warning, or impatience. Someone wanted Sir Giles to act." Mrs. Blythe sank into a chair. "He was very pale that night," she said. "I brought him his tea. He barely touched it." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Did anyone else bring him anything?" Mrs. Blythe shook her head. "No, he dismissed everyone early." Rupert stopped pacing. "You think he was alone?" "I think he believed he was," Miss Marple said. She rose slowly, her joints protesting, and walked to the window. Outside, dusk had settled fully, the lake now a dark mirror reflecting nothing. "Who benefits from Sir Giles's silence?" she asked quietly. No one answered at once. The question hovered, uncomfortable and accusatory. Lady Hawthorne closed her eyes briefly. "If the truth came out," she said, "this house might be lost." "And someone else might gain it," Miss Marple said. Rupert's hand tightened around the button in his pocket. "Tonight," Miss Marple added calmly, "I should like to sit in the library after dark. Secrets, you see, are more talkative at night, and whoever has been walking through walls may not be finished yet." The fire hissed softly as a log shifted, and for the first time since Miss Marple's arrival, no one argued with her at all. Night settled over Hawthorne Manor with a deliberation that felt almost intentional, as though the house were choosing the moment to exhale. Lamps were lit one by one, their light pooling weakly in corridors that seemed to absorb it. Miss Marple took her place in the library shortly after dinner, settling into a high-backed chair near the desk where Sir Giles had died. She had brought her knitting, not because she intended to use it much, but because it gave her hands something harmless to do while her mind remained alert. Lady Hawthorne had insisted on staying nearby, though Miss Marple gently persuaded her to sit in the adjoining drawing room instead. Isabel lingered uncertainly before being sent upstairs, and Rupert had disappeared with a muttered remark about fresh air. Only Mrs. Blythe moved through the house with her usual precision, though Miss Marple noted that she avoided the west wing entirely. The library was very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of books and contemplation, but a taut silence threaded with expectation. The fire burned low, its embers shifting now and then with a soft, sighing sound. Miss Marple counted those sounds carefully, separating them in her mind from anything that did not belong. She had not waited long when she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, so soft it might easily have been dismissed as wood contracting in the cold. It came from behind the bookcase. Tap, pause, tap, tap. Then nothing. Miss Marple did not move. She let several minutes pass, her needles clicking gently, deliberately irregular, as though she were an elderly woman passing the time rather than listening with fierce concentration. When the tapping came again, closer this time, she rose quietly and crossed the room. She pressed her hand against the bookcase. It yielded just enough to confirm what she already knew. Someone was on the other side of the wall. Miss Marple returned to her chair and waited. Patience, she reflected, was often mistaken for passivity. The tapping resumed, more insistent now, and with it came the faintest scrape, like a boot brushing stone. At last, the shelf shifted, just a fraction. A breath of cold air slipped into the room, carrying with it the smell of damp earth. A shadow moved in the narrow gap. Miss Marple cleared her throat. The effect was immediate. The movement froze. The shelf stilled, and for a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then, very slowly, the bookcase swung open. The man who stepped through was not young, but neither was he old. His coat was worn and spattered with dried mud, and his face bore the tight, guarded expression of someone long accustomed to being unwelcome. He stared at Miss Marple with open disbelief. "You," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I had hoped it would be you." His eyes flicked toward the door. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "You're here to reclaim something." His mouth tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," Miss Marple said gently. "You are descended from the man who owned this house before the Hawthornes. The man who disappeared." He stiffened. "They stole it." "They acquired it," Miss Marple corrected. "Under circumstances that were, shall we say, questionable." "You make it sound very polite," he said bitterly. "My grandfather died in that passage, trapped there when the war was sealed, and they told the village he fell into the lake." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes softened. "Sir Giles discovered the truth," she said. "He found the records, and perhaps other remains." The man swallowed. "I warned him to give it back. The papers, the proof. And he refused," Miss Marple said. "Not because he didn't believe you, but because he wanted to reveal it properly, publicly." The man's shoulders sagged. "I never meant—" He broke off, his voice thick. "I tapped to frighten him, to make him listen. And when he came down here alone," Miss Marple said softly, "his heart failed him." Silence stretched between them, heavy but no longer hostile. "You didn't kill him," Miss Marple said, "but you frightened him to death. That is something you will have to live with." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Rupert appeared in the doorway, his face pale as he took in the scene. "So it's true," he said. "All of it." Lady Hawthorne followed him in, drawn by the raised voices. When she saw the man, her hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple spoke calmly. "Sir Giles intended to make this right," she said. "To return what was taken. His death prevented him." The man looked at Lady Hawthorne, something like apology flickering across his features. "I only wanted what was ours." Lady Hawthorne straightened. "Then it shall be returned," she said quietly. "The truth, and whatever else must follow." The man nodded once, then stepped back, as though the fight had gone out of him entirely. Miss Marple watched as the bookcase closed again, sealing the passage not in secrecy, but in finality. The house seemed to settle, a long-held tension easing at last. Sir Giles' heart, she reflected, had not failed without cause. It had failed under the weight of a truth too long buried. The arrival of the constable came quietly, without drama, summoned by Lady Hawthorne with a calm that surprised even herself. Hawthorne Manor, which had seemed to crouch in expectation for days, accepted the intrusion with weary resignation. Miss Marple observed from the edge of the library as the man from the passage gave his name, Thomas Reed, and told his story in a voice stripped of anger and ornament. Truth, when it finally emerged, often sounded disappointingly plain. Sir Giles's records were brought out then, the neat handwriting suddenly transformed from scholarly habit into silent accusation. Deeds altered and redrawn, payments disguised as repairs, a renovation carried out with unseemly haste decades earlier. Reed's grandfather had been a stubborn man, it seemed, unwilling to sell and too inconvenient to silence cleanly. The accident had been engineered not by clumsy hands, but by deliberate ones, the passage sealed while he was still alive, the house settling over him like a lid. Lady Hawthorne listened without interruption, her face pale but resolute. Rupert said nothing at all. His earlier defiance had drained away, replaced by something close to shame. Miss Marple noticed that he did not look at Reed once, only at the floor, as though the weight of inheritance had at last become unbearable. Dr. Finch arrived late, summoned hurriedly, his bluster subdued by the gravity of the room. He examined the papers, frowned, and finally conceded what Miss Marple had already known, that Sir Giles' heart, though weak, had been pushed beyond its limits by terror and shock. There would be no charge of murder, only a verdict that balanced on the uncomfortable edge between misadventure and moral responsibility. "And the tapping?" the constable asked. Reed nodded. "I wanted him to come down. to see what he'd done. I never thought—" His voice broke and he stopped. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "People rarely think past the moment of confrontation," she said. "They imagine justice will be tidy." The constable cleared his throat, uncomfortable but professional. Arrangements were made with minimal fuss. Reed would remain in the village until matters were settled properly. The law, long denied its role, would now have its say. When at last they were alone again, the house felt different. Lighter somehow, though nothing tangible had changed. The portraits along the walls seemed less watchful, the shadows less intent. Lady Hawthorne sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "Giles would have wanted this," she said quietly. The truth, however damaging. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, though he might have preferred to survive it. Rupert ran a hand through his hair. "I thought he was ruining us," he said hoarsely, "dragging up things that should have stayed buried. I never imagined that the house itself was built on a lie," Miss Marple finished gently. Rupert gave a short, bitter laugh. "I suppose I did imagine it. I just didn't want it to be true." Isabel stood near the window, watching the first pale light of dawn touch the lake. "What will happen now?" she asked. Lady Hawthorne straightened. "The estate will be restored to its rightful owners, or sold if that is what they wish. Whatever remains after will be adjusted." Rupert flinched at the word but did not argue. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, which she had not completed a single stitch of. "Houses," she said thoughtfully, "have long memories. They do not forgive being built on injustice. They wait." Lady Hawthorne looked at her with quiet gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." Miss Marple smiled. "You already have. By listening." Morning arrived properly then, with servants moving cautiously through the halls and Mrs. Blythe resuming her duties as though order might be restored through routine alone. She paused when she saw Miss Marple, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I always thought there was something wrong with that wall," she said. "I could hear it at night." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You heard what others chose not to," she said. "That is no small thing." By midday, the truth had begun its slow migration beyond the manor wall. In Little Melford, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into the sober acknowledgement that something long suspected had at last been confirmed. The village did not rejoice. It rarely did. Instead, it absorbed the knowledge and adjusted itself around it, as villages always did. Miss Marple took her leave shortly after luncheon. Lady Hawthorne accompanied her to the door, standing very straight. "I shall miss him," Lady Hawthorne said suddenly. "For all his flaws?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "He was trying, in his way, to set things right. That counts for something." As the car pulled away, Hawthorne Manor receded behind the hawthorn trees, its windows catching the light without the earlier gloom. Miss Marple watched until it disappeared from view. Some secrets, she reflected, were never meant to remain buried. They pressed upward through stone and silence alike, until someone listened closely enough to hear them knocking. The days that followed unfolded with a subdued inevitability, as though Hawthorne Manor itself were guiding events toward their proper places. Miss Marple remained at the village inn, rather than returning immediately to St. Mary Mead, accepting Lady Hawthorne's quiet insistence that matters were not yet settled. Truth, once uncovered, had a habit of stirring the sediment around it before the water could clear. Thomas Reed stayed in Little Melford under the watchful but not unkind eye of the authorities. He walked the lanes each morning, hat pulled low, greeting no one unless greeted first. Villagers observed him with the same cautious curiosity they extended to any newcomer who arrived bearing an old story made new. Miss Marple noticed that he lingered often by the churchyard, standing near the edge where the ground dipped slightly, as though measuring distances only he could see. Lady Hawthorne began sorting Sir Giles's papers in earnest. The task seemed to steady her. Each document laid out, each signature examined, was a step away from confusion and towards something like acceptance. Miss Marple visited her one afternoon to find her surrounded by stacks of yellowed deeds and correspondence, her expression grave but focused. "I always thought Giles was obsessed," Lady Hawthorne said quietly. "Now I see he was burdened." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Burdened people are often mistaken for difficult ones." Rupert hovered at the edges of these efforts, offering help he did not quite know how to give. He read when asked, fetched when asked, and otherwise kept his distance, as though afraid that too much involvement might be read as self-interest. Miss Marple observed him closely. Guilt, she knew, could be either corrosive or clarifying. "It wasn't just the house," Rupert said to her one morning when they found themselves alone in the garden. "The money, the position, all of it came from that one act. I can't stop thinking about it." "That is conscience," Miss Marple said. "It has been dormant for a long time. It will ache at first." "And then?" Rupert asked. "And then," Miss Marple replied gently, "it will tell you what sort of man you wish to be." Isabel moved through these days with a quiet intensity, her notebooks filling rapidly. She no longer hid her writing, no longer smudged the ink in nervous haste. Miss Marple suspected that the truth of Hawthorne Manor had unlocked something in her as well, a recognition that stories did not lose their power simply because they were uncomfortable. "The house feels different," Isabel said one evening as they walked near the lake, "as though it's breathing." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "It has been holding its breath for a very long time." The legal proceedings advanced with steady thoroughness. There was no appetite for spectacle. The facts were clear, the evidence painstaking. Ownership would be restored where possible, compensation arranged where restoration could not undo the past. Hawthorne Manor's future remained uncertain, but no longer dishonest. Mrs. Blythe, too, seemed altered. She spoke more freely now, no longer guarding each sentence as though it might collapse the ceiling. One afternoon, she admitted to Miss Marple that she had known something was wrong for years. "I thought it was just old age," she said, "hearing things, feeling watched." "Sometimes," Miss Marple replied. "It is not age at all. It is instinct." The villagers adjusted, as villagers always did. The post office buzzed with low conversation. The butcher shook his head thoughtfully. The vicar preached a sermon on restitution that was pointed without being accusatory. No one spoke Sir Giles' name with condemnation. Instead, they spoke it with a kind of rueful respect, as though acknowledging that even late justice required courage. Miss Marple spent her evenings walking the lanes, reflecting. She thought of Sir Giles in the library, surrounded by his carefully ordered world, suddenly confronted with the disorder beneath it. Fear had done what threats and arguments had not. It had stopped his heart, but not his intention. On her final night in Little Melford, Miss Marple stood once more at the edge of the lake. The water was still, reflecting the stars with deceptive calm. Somewhere beneath the house, stone and earth lay undisturbed at last, no longer concealing a wrong, but marking it. Lady Hawthorne joined her, drawing her shawl close. "I don't know what Hawthorne Manor will become," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied, "but whatever it is, it will be honest." Lady Hawthorne smiled faintly. "That seems very important to you." "It is," Miss Marple said simply. They stood together in silence, not companionable exactly, but shared. Some silences were no longer oppressive once the truth had been spoken. Miss Marple felt the familiar sense of closure beginning to form, not an ending, precisely, but a settling. There were still consequences to unfold, lives to realign, decisions yet to be made. But the secret beneath Hawthorne Manor had lost its power to harm. It had been named, acknowledged, and brought into the light, where even the most painful truths could finally rest. Miss Marple's departure was delayed by one final request, delivered in Lady Hawthorne's careful handwriting and accompanied by a sense of unfinished business that Miss Marple recognized at once. There were details, Lady Hawthorne wrote, that troubled her still, small inconsistencies that refused to settle neatly into the larger truth. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the smallest disquiet often concealed the sharpest edges, returned to Hawthorne Manor the following afternoon. Lady Hawthorne received her in the library, now brighter, the curtains drawn back as if the room were determined not to harbor shadows again. Yet something remained unresolved, and Miss Marple felt it as soon as she entered, a faint dissonance like a note slightly off-key. "I keep thinking about the night Giles died," Lady Hawthorne said. "Not the passage, not the tapping, but the timing." Miss Marple sat down, attentive. "Go on." "He dismissed the servants early," Lady Hawthorne continued. "But Mrs. Blythe swears she saw light under the library door much later than he claimed he would stay up." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And that troubles you?" "Yes," Lady Hawthorne said. "Because Giles was meticulous. He never lied about such things." Miss Marple considered this. Truth, she knew, was not a single thread, but a weave. "Pull one," and others followed. They sent for Mrs. Blythe, who arrived with the same careful composure she had adopted since the revelations. When questioned, she nodded firmly. "I brought Sir Giles his tea at 9:30, she said. "He told me to go. But when I went to lock up, close to 11, the light was still on." "Did you knock?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Mrs. Blythe said. "He didn't like to be disturbed." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "something disturbed him." Miss Marple asked to see the teacup. It had been preserved out of habit rather than suspicion, set aside with Sir Giles' other personal effects. She examined it carefully, noting the faint residue at the bottom, darker than tea alone would account for. "Did Sir Giles take sugar?" she asked. Mrs. Blythe shook her head. "Never." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Habit is a very revealing thing." They sent next for Dr. Finch, whose irritation at being recalled was barely concealed. Miss Marple asked him with great politeness about Sir Giles' medication. "He was prescribed digitalis," Dr. Finch said shortly. "A standard dose." "And when was it last administered?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Finch hesitated. "He took it himself." "Always?" Miss Marple pressed. "Well," Dr. Finch frowned. "Mrs. Blythe sometimes prepared it." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And did you notice anything unusual when you examined the body?" Dr. Finch stiffened. "I told you, his heart failed." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but failure can be encouraged." The room grew very quiet. "I think," Miss Marple continued, "that Sir Giles was frightened that night. Frightened enough to exacerbate a weak heart. But I also think he may have been given more than his prescribed dose of medication." Lady Hawthorne gasped softly. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied, "that someone wished to ensure he did not live to reveal what he had discovered." All eyes turned to Dr. Finch. His face reddened. "This is outrageous." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "You were very eager to declare the matter settled, and you had much to lose if the truth came out. Your practice, your standing, your family benefited from the Hawthornes' patronage." Dr. Finch's mouth opened, then closed. His composure cracked. "I only meant to calm him," he said finally. "He was frantic. He begged me to help him sleep." "And you gave him too much," Miss Marple said softly. "Perhaps not intending death, but unwilling to risk his speaking." The silence that followed was thick with realization. Lady Hawthorne stood slowly. "You killed him," she said, her voice steady despite the words. "No," Dr. Finch said hoarsely. "I didn't know—" "You knew enough," Miss Marple said. "Enough to be afraid of the truth yourself." The constable was summoned once more. Dr. Finch did not resist. His defeat was complete, his earlier certainty now revealed as fear masquerading as authority. When he was gone, Lady Hawthorne sank into her chair, trembling. "So Giles was right to be afraid," she whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but also right to act." Lady Hawthorne looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "Will it ever end?" Miss Marple reached for her hand. "It has ended," she said gently. "Now it will resolve." The library felt lighter again, the final knot loosened. Sir Giles's death, once shrouded in ambiguity, now stood revealed in its full, tragic complexity, not a single cause, but a convergence of buried wrongs, fear, and human frailty. Miss Marple rose to leave, satisfied at last. The truth, though painful, had been fully spoken, and only then, she knew, could Hawthorne Manor truly be free. The morning Miss Marple finally left Hawthorne Manor dawned clear and pale, the sort of morning that suggested endings rather than beginnings. The house stood quietly behind her as she paused at the threshold, its windows reflecting light without secrecy now, as though nothing remained that wished to hide. Lady Hawthorne walked with her as far as the drive. She looked older than she had a fortnight before, but steadier too, as if the strain of uncertainty had been replaced by something heavier, yet more bearable. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, often weighed more than lies, but it balanced better. "It seems extraordinary," Lady Hawthorne said, breaking the silence, "that all of it could happen at once, as though everything waited for the same moment to fall apart." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It rarely happens all at once," she said. "It only appears that way when one finally looks in the right direction." Lady Hawthorne nodded. "Dr. Finch will stand trial." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Not for murder in the strictest sense, perhaps, but for what matters just as much, fearful interference and deliberate excess." He nudged a man already at the edge. "And Thomas Reed?" "He frightened Sir Giles," Miss Marple said. "But fear alone is not guilt. He sought restitution, not death. That distinction is important." Lady Hawthorne stopped walking. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "That there was more than one cause?" Miss Marple considered her carefully. "I suspected," she said. "Sir Giles was surrounded by pressure from all sides. Truth below his feet, threats in the dark, and a man he trusted offering help at precisely the wrong moment. Death is often a collaboration." Lady Hawthorne closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this. "You let us believe it was simpler." "I allowed events to speak in their proper order," Miss Marple replied. "People confess to what they understand. Dr. Finch did not yet understand himself." They resumed walking. Gravel crunched softly beneath their feet. "I should have seen him more clearly," Lady Hawthorne said. "His eagerness, his certainty." "Certainty is comforting," Miss Marple said, "especially to those who fear exposure. Dr. Finch lived very close to this house's reputation. When it began to crack, so did his composure." They reached the gate. Beyond it, the village road lay open and ordinary, indifferent to the weight of what had been settled behind them. Rupert emerged from the house then, hat in hand. He hesitated, then approached, his expression earnest in a way it had not been before. "I wanted to thank you," he said to Miss Marple, "and to tell you I'm leaving." "Leaving?" Lady Hawthorne asked. "For a while," Rupert said. "There's money to be returned, accounts to straighten. I can't do that properly from here, and I don't think I deserve to stay." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Running away and stepping aside are not the same thing," she said. "You're doing the latter." Rupert flushed slightly. "I should have listened to Giles. I mocked him instead." "You listened in the end," Miss Marple said. "That too matters." Isabel appeared in the doorway, notebook tucked under her arm. She smiled shyly at Miss Marple. "I've been writing it all down," she said. "Not the scandal. The truth." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Truth is quite scandalous enough on its own," she said. The car arrived then, punctual and unremarkable. Miss Marple accepted Lady Hawthorne's embrace with gentle firmness. "The house will change hands," Lady Hawthorne said, "or perhaps be opened. Thomas Reed has spoken of restoring it not as it was, but as it should have been." "That sounds sensible," Miss Marple said. "Houses are like people, improve when they stop pretending." As the car pulled away, Miss Marple watched Hawthorne Manor recede for the final time. It no longer seemed to loom. It stood simply, a structure of stone and memory, relieved of the burden of secrecy. The drive through Little Melford passed quietly. Villagers went about their errands with the careful normality that followed disruption. Miss Marple knew that in time the story would soften at the edges, reduced to a cautionary tale, and then, eventually, to history. At the station, the porter recognized her this time and smiled without reservation. "All sorted, then?" he asked. "As much as such things ever are," Miss Marple replied. The train carried her away through fields newly turned, the earth dark and honest. She settled into her seat, folding her hands, allowing herself a moment of reflection. Sir Giles had died because he stood at the convergence of truths long delayed. A frightened heir seeking justice, a respected doctor guarding his own fragile position, a house built upon an injustice that demanded recognition. No single act had killed him, but together they had pressed too hard. Justice, Miss Marple knew, was not always neat. It did not restore the dead, nor erase suffering. But it did something quieter and more enduring. It set things back into alignment. As the countryside slid past the window, Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of completion, not triumph, but resolution. The secret beneath Hawthorne Manor had been exposed not by force, but by patience, listening, and the steady insistence that truth, however inconvenient, must be faced. And that, she thought, was quite enough for one mystery.